area where residents, a small group of residents, 5 or 6, cleaned up 12 tons of trash and have created this garden oasis with a theater for kids and all this other infrastructure, community garden infrastructure. This is Vale Encantado, which is a favela in the heart of the Tijuca forest that has kind of as a vocation becoming the first sustainable favela. I'll talk about that one a little bit more in a little bit. And in Alemão, they have a very well-recognized, this is a community that's internationally in the news. You almost always see it associated with crime and violence. But they have one of Rio's most innovative kind of environmental research favela units where they try all sorts of different green technologies in the community. This is from an article on Rio Watch by an architect looking at qualities of urban informality. He looks at flexibility of the design. This is an example from City of God. There's an architect from Europe that's been looking at how they actually take the public housing, which is, creates, like I said, these isolated units that are not flexible. And then in City of God, they've actually made it into a favela, incorporating these flexible elements in the design of the community. Affordable housing solution. We've talked about that. Sustainability. We've talked a little, we'll talk more. Culture, community, and sociability. These are all qualities of favelas. Aesthetics, which can be subjective, of course, but there are more people recognizing there's a quality element to that. There was an exhibition last year at Studio X in Rio about favela design. Looked at lots of different things. There's a group in Australia now studying how favelas seem to have this ability to reconfigure themselves based on needs. They're not over-designed or predetermined. The separation between public and private spaces isn't strict, allowing for strong adaptation between the two. A washing line strung across the road, for example, or a public workshop operating out of a private house. In many ways, they're the epitome of affordable living, being located in a place that allows residents to be entrepreneurial and have access to ways of making a living. Contrast that with Australia. When they set up affordable housing, they're often putting in areas where it's very difficult for people to access work, and the cost of living is not affordable, as we're doing in Rio, unfortunately, as well. There's a new book called Radical Cities. This architect is looking at the idea of informal settlements around the world, expanding, right? Talks about how we should adapt to informality rather than ignore it, right? So we've been working with the idea that maybe we should take this leap, right, towards looking at favelas as a potential of sustainable development. This began because late last year, the architect who created, one of the co-creators of LEED ND, which is, LEED is the designation of, is the US Green Building Council. It's the standard certification for green buildings. I'm sure you have some LEED buildings on campus probably, right? And there are different gradations of LEED. There's also now a LEED for Neighborhood Development certification. It means the whole neighborhood is sustainable. And there are a whole variety of criteria for LEED for Neighborhood Development. So late last year, the architect, one of the co-creators of this system of LEED ND, reached out to us, and he wanted to start thinking about creating a LEED Up. So the idea is a certification for upgrading informal settlements. And you look at all these different issues within a community. Residents go through and they evaluate which are their most pressing needs in terms of energy, communication, sanitation, food, common spaces, education, solid waste, access and mobility, restoration, water, and housing. And they draw those up in order of priority, right? Prioritize those that create local jobs. You look at different LEED partners, LEED technologies that could apply. And then you start a process where you actually try to upgrade the favela rather than create something from scratch. Of course, this is not a formal certification. Maybe it could be one day, maybe it couldn't, but it can push the boundaries of our thinking and help lead us in the way. This is really important because, for example, I mentioned that in Rio, sanitation, the sewage, everybody's sewage goes into the open ocean. So it's actually much more potential if we actually take the favelas and individually create local sewage solutions, whether it's biodigesters or different types of cleaning mechanisms. We've been working with a favela called Vale Encantado, which is in the middle of the forest. And the reason we've been working with this particular favela is they have a vocation for this already. They have a co-op that's focused on sustainability. They produce food locally. They create different organic foods in their kitchen. They have a little restaurant. We've been helping them. We identified an international partner. We've been developing the biodigester here. That's what that did to show the scale. Solar panels, they've started working, incorporating. And so this particular favela has a vocation for this. Now they're in the middle of the forest. So this isn't all of Rio. The west zone is still all the way over there. But you can see that it's between the north zone and Baja, and then the south zone over here. There it is, and as you come in. Now it's a small community. It's only 140 homes or people, which makes it really good for a lab, basically. Like it's a really good trial space. And people could come there and learn from what they've done. These are the priorities they identified in this order. Because, for example, their water comes straight from the forest. They don't feel clean water is an issue for them. These are the things they prioritize. Right? So we've been working with them on looking at these different aspects, identifying needs, looking at potential solutions. When we did this charrette at the Green Building Conference in Sao Paulo in August, these were the questions we asked to the architects and others that were there, looking at strategies that could be employed, what would generate jobs, what would be most viable, and so on. So I'm not going to go into more detail about the lead aspect, but we can talk about it. This is very much at the beginning, and if anybody wants to get involved, please do. So in terms of just concluding, I talked about how there are more people seeing the potential and the role of favelas. This is starting to change. This is very recent, the last couple of years. Rio's favelas are our affordable housing stock. What would Rio be if we embrace the unique history and heritage of these favelas, recognize each individual community, their contribution. You go into one favela and you might go to one next door and you have a very different experience. They're very unique places. What if we honored that and actually recognized it and helped them develop in ways that supported that through participatory projects? Now, not to compare it with Santorini, Greece, because Rio's favelas are unique in and of themselves in very positive ways. But the idea that there are places that are very unique, that are similar, that are valued. It's similar in their design, I should say, in some ways. So when you walk around in a favela on a hillside in Rio, people often will say, oh, I feel like I'm in a Mediterranean villa or a Mediterranean town. Or have you been to such and such a town? It feels very similar to this. So the idea just, we should be thinking creatively about these places. And Rio could set an example for the world, a new type of participatory integration. Leadership that's needed. I mentioned a third of humanity's living is going to be living in urban informal settlements by 2050. We need to paint a new direction, how we're going to support these communities and incorporate them. There are lots of ways to get involved with us. Meg, for example, has been an international observer with CatComm in Rio. She's written some articles for us while she was there. We've had, please stay informed. It's very important. There's probably never been a city in history more concerned with its international image than Rio right now, especially in the recent past, but I think leading up to the Olympics. The city's, its logic is that, okay, by 2016 we'll show the world how we've changed. And then investment will grow and people will want to visit and so on. So staying informed and staying engaged actually has an impact. We have a favela perception survey we're doing again this year, sharing technology strategies. This one applies to anybody doing any research in any community anywhere. Just kind of something we've learned the hard way. We need to research qualities. So when we're working in a difficult neighborhood or a place that has challenges, if we're only looking at the challenges and the problems, we're going to be creating policies that address those, but may very well undo qualities. And then we're losing. And then how do you weigh those against each other? So if we're aware of the qualities, if we research the qualities, then we can make sure, okay, these we want to preserve, whatever we do next. And then if media, of course, we're always looking for new people to sign up for monthly $3 or up donations, because that's how we maintain our flexibility. And we can sign up for Rio and Watch. You can sign up for our monthly digest. This is what it looks like. every month we go through a lot of effort to curate and compile all of the latest media coverage on favelas in English. So you can literally, in your inbox, get the benefits of that work. All of the right-hand column will be just publications, blogs, newspapers, etc., about anything mentioning favelas that month, and then Rio Unwatched articles on the left. So you can either sign up on that form or just sign up on our website if you're interested. So that's the presentation. If you guys have any questions.
So open for questions.
Yeah, please.
What penetration you have there is with the government? Do they listen to you?
Well, so it's complicated. Because initially we thought, okay, it looked like intentions were good enough because the policies are often well written, especially the local. So we work mostly locally. I've been thinking recently maybe we should try to dialogue more with national or other levels, but we work mostly locally. So with local government, we have great contacts within government, technical people. But when it comes to policymakers, we have interacted. But when we were, a couple of years ago, we were getting prepared to actually come and try to sit down with politicians and talk. But we realized from the events unfolding at the time that actually the intentions were clearly misaligned. And there was actually not going to be very much use in trying to dialogue directly. So our strategy has been to get public exposure, public debate, more awareness, because those eventually affect things. So yeah. But we have good relationships with people in government, technical people and so on. A couple of city council people too. Occasionally there's somebody who's fighting on behalf of some of these communities and will be supporting with information, or they back and forth.
Alberto, did you have a question?
Yeah, but you work only in Rio, or there are other cities in Brazil that are going through similar?
There are lots of, there's cities going through similar things at different scales. Rio is more intense because I think a combination of factors between the type of policymakers and the politicians and the interests, the economic interests, and the Olympics, which is only in Rio. But the reason we work in Rio is not because of that. It's because that's where we've always worked. Catalytic Communities work is always local with this very global kind of connection. So the idea is we do things locally with a lot of attention, but then we share what we're doing globally so that hopefully it supports other people and they get information or use ideas. We share, we learn from others, but we don't actually implement projects in other cities. It's just, it would create, pull us apart a little bit from our focus.
Within Rio, do you collaborate with other groups?
Yeah.
NGOs?
Lots, yeah. So we collaborate with, we're really a network. And everything we do is a network. In our work, we have a staff of 4 to 5, and then we have about 100 volunteers. We have 12 to 20 interns at any time. And then we work with organizations across the city. Most of our partners are community organizations in favelas. So like I said, we've worked with over 200 communities over the years, and in each of them, there's a local organization or a local leader or a resident working on some sort of collective project. So we focus our work to support people doing something on behalf of the community. It can be an individual or an organization. We don't focus, for example, on individuals or private. Like, we wouldn't be helping someone start a business, but we would help somebody start an organization to support local groups or something, local residents. So we've got, hundreds of those. And then there are local NGOs that we have a good relationship with, and we exchange information, and whether it's, NGOs working with favelas or think tanks or universities. It's really all over.
I don't want to monopolize.
No, it's okay.
But I had other questions.
Oh, sure.
One of them. Sorry, did Mary Lou?
Do you want to go first, Severina? Or
So what is the, for in terms of us
It's over 60% black. Some are higher, but in every favela it's over 60%.
So they are basically the equivalent of the black slaves here, but in the South American lands.
There are many people that, interesting, recently, so in Brazil we have something called the quilombo. The quilombos are these sites where you can trace, they started as, the first quilombos were during slavery, when slaves would flee into a village. They would call it a quilombo, and they would protect themselves and keep them, from being taken back into slavery. After slavery, former slaves, they were that settled somewhere, started calling those quilombos. In some cases where they were local to where they had been, they would still call them a quilombo. But what happened was, by 1988, by the Constitution, there were enough of these communities that could trace their heritage back to those times that now they started calling quilombos any settlement that you can trace back to slavery. And more recently now, they're even making that a little bit more flexible, which I'm still understanding. So there is, and then now, just the last year, I started hearing especially young activists in favelas calling favelas urban quilombos. So implying that what a favela is by nature a quilombo, which is really interesting because that has a whole bunch of other implications, because quilombos are collective spaces which fight for collective property rights, not individual, and fight to preserve themselves rather than to be able to sell off and dismantle. The idea is that quilombo stays a quilombo. So when you get quilombo status from the federal government, you're prohibited from selling the land, but it's yours as a collective. So it's interesting. Yeah, there's relationships between it.
Okay. If no one has a question, then I have another one, which is, if from time to time Rio goes through these mega projects where they destroy not only entire neighborhoods, but intangible parts of that, like culture. And for example, there was the Pereira Passos construction of destruction of the narrow streets, and the Morro do Castelo was totally raised in downtown Rio. And in doing so, much cultural destruction was done. Also for the construction of Avenida Presidente Vargas, the monkey neighborhood, Praça 11, which was a major site for samba, was eliminated. So about the construction that's currently going on now in the port area, heading toward the international airport, where the port is, and they're calling Porto Maravilha. How much destruction is taking place, not only of neighborhoods, but of culture?
Yes, this is a big problem. And yes, it's a historic thing that recurs. Always often in relation to international image, right? There are events. I think there was an expo
There was an expo
years
The
ago.
Pereira Passos was
Right,
added
during
to that Exposição Nacional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's true. And in Rio now, we're living one of these, except, I don't know, on steroids in a way, because it's a new time with more money, with the Olympics. The Olympics are one of those crazy things, you think it's going to be a good thing, because you think the Olympics, it's so warm and friendly, and, it's a good thing for the city. And development, how could that be bad? And these resources coming in from the federal government, investing in our city, isn't that good? In the case of Brazil, a lot of resources are coming in from the federal government. But what actually happens is you create this period, which academics call, state of exception. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that phrase, when there's a period before the mega event when traditional laws don't have to be followed. For example, the participation elements and the public debate and proof of the need for something. And so the government says, okay, we've got 2016, we've got a deadline, we've got a plan for the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, we have to fulfill. There's no conversation about who came up with that plan, who made those decisions on behalf of the city. So it creates this huge opportunity. And yes, in Rio, there's several zones. Those zones that were on that map, that were in the circles, are the most affected. But the port is really the worst, the one you bring up now, in terms of the history being affected, because it's the most historical of those 4 areas. So the 4 areas are the port, the Jacarepaguá Lagoon area, which is more recent development, except for one community really being massively impacted. Copacabana, which they're not doing things that are distorted particularly, and then Diodoro, which is a military base area that they were reconstructing. So it's really the port. And in the port area, the port is where, now going back to the history, Brazil had 4 times the number of slaves as the United States. So we had 4 million Africans come in, many through that port. I don't remember the number that came in through Rio's port, okay? But that's the port. So, Valongo, yeah. And there's a wharf there. And about more than 15 years ago now, probably 18 years ago, there was a couple who lived in a house, who just bought a house a couple of blocks from there. They moved in, started digging, and they found some bones. And they creeped out, called the police, said, we don't know what this is. Then it started being investigated. Archaeologists came in. They found that it was a cemetery. It was a slave burial ground where anybody who either arrived dead or died before they were sold, their skulls were crushed, and it's in this massive, it's under the port in Rio. So this family, this couple, they actually took it on as their life's mission. They turned their house into a museum, and they bought the house next door, and they created a little museum. And so anyway, this is one couple, right? This whole area is full of this kind of history, which needs to be dealt with. You know, in the U.S., you have Black History Month, kids, for all the pros and cons, whether it's well done or poorly done, or you grow up, at least since I was growing up in the, since civil rights on, in many parts of the U.S., there's been an attempt to deal with the history around slavery. In Brazil, that's never happened. We've never gone through that period. It's all crushed. It's all denied. And the Port of Rio is really a symbol of that. And so, yeah, and there's this where the first sambas were composed. It's where, capoeira, all this resistance. There's the first favela, Providencia, is in the port. All of this is in the port area. And so there's a quilombo there as well in the port. And so now we come in, Trump Towers. There's going to be 3 Trump Towers. There's going to be all these warehouses. They're going to put in these bikeways, trying to make it into an urban, what you think of as a global city port zone. But actually, that a lot is potentially lost in this process. So it's complicated. There are people, fighting for it. There's the historic patrimony unit in the city government seems fairly concerned with this, but they're really fighting against quite a monster because it's a huge amount of land in a great area. It's been all of a sudden is available. Oh, and part of the reason the port can develop now is because a lot of that land is federal because it belonged to the Marine, to the Navy, and that was federal. And because I was talking about the lack of federal, state, local, they were always at odds until this administration. So before, the federal government would never give them that access to that land. So there were all these old Navy warehouses empty, abandoned. The whole port was abandoned. A lot of that was federal land. And now, with this revitalization project, the federal government has basically handed it over. So there's all this development now happening there. And they,
So are we ready for the group?
I can show the building, yeah.
Just a quick question. Do you have something in your website or in your materials like how to avoid this recipe for gentrification? And it's like, are people listening to you? Because maybe with good intentions in their projects,
Sure.
like maybe the IDB is funding these things that were supposed to come out right, but then
Right.
you have this erosion of social capital and all that.
Yeah.
And having people like Stuart Brand, for example, have you heard his talk?
No. Oh, I have his book, but I haven't heard his talk.
About the 4 heresies of environmental environmentalism.
Okay.
The first one is precisely building on the power of what we call slums in general, worldwide.
Okay.
But it's pretty powerful.
I
So
haven't seen it.
there seems to be like some
Good.
need
Good, yeah.
to pay attention to this. So,
Good.
so how is your group viewed in the mainstream and that?
So with the gentrification issue, because we were the first to kind of bring it up, we've been called on quite a few times locally to be on debates, on TV, on radio. There was a politician even that reached out to talk about gentrification in favelas with us. So we've been able to kind of bring some visibility, but it's you know it's a city of 6 million people. You know all the how many people do you really reach with any given act? So yeah, we've been engaged in that, but it's a big process because people are acting as individuals. You know, there's this whole gentrification is very complicated because you're in the favela and it's a collective space by nature, really. But you have your individual house, and some people act more individualistic and some people act more, and people's interests are. And how do you then protect something when individuals don't want that? So that's probably the biggest debate on gentrification within the favelas is the conflict between a few people who say, well, I have my right. I built my house and now I want to sell it and make a lot of money. Perfectly legitimate argument. But then this big picture issue where people say, well, we're going to lose our community, or we'll lose our affordable housing, or whatever it is. So it's a complicated debate, and one we're engaged in, but not, there's no conclusion. It's going to be a while. But I mean, I think what's interesting to note is that favelas do have a collective. It's not any neighborhood, right, that's gentrifying. These are neighborhoods that allows residents to be entrepreneurial and have access to ways of making a living. Contrast that with Australia. When they set up affordable housing, they're often putting in areas where it's very difficult for people to access work, and the cost of living is not affordable, as we're doing in Rio, unfortunately, as well. There's a new book called Radical Cities. This architect is looking at the idea of informal settlements around the world, expanding, right? Talks about how we should adapt to informality rather than ignore it, right? So we've been working with the idea that maybe we should take this leap, right, towards looking at favelas as a potential of sustainable development. This began because late last year, the architect who one of the co-creators of LEED MD, which is, LEED is the designation of, is the U.S. Green Building Councils. It's the standard certification for green buildings. I'm sure you have some LEED buildings on campus probably, right? And there are different gradations of LEED. There's also now a LEED for neighbors, like I said, these are isolated units that are not flexible. And then in the city of Gone, they've actually made it into a favela, incorporating these flexible elements in the design of the community. Affordable housing solution, we've talked about that. Sustainability, we've talked a little, we'll talk more. Culture, community, and sociability. These are all qualities of favelas. Aesthetics, which can be subjective, of course, but there are more people recognizing there's a quality element to that. There was an exhibition last year at Studio X in Rio about favela design. Looked at lots of different things. There's a group in Australia now studying how favelas seem to have this ability to reconfigure themselves based on needs. They're not over-designed or predetermined. The separation between public and private spaces isn't strict, allowing for strong adaptation between the two. A washing line strung across the road, for example, or a public workshop operating out of a private house. In many ways, they're the epitome of affordable living, being located in a place area where residents, a small group of residents, 5 or 6, cleaned up 12 tons of trash and have created this garden oasis with a theater for kids and all this other infrastructure, community garden infrastructure. This is Vale Encantado, which is a favela in the heart of the Tijuca forest that has kind of as a vocation becoming the first sustainable favela. I'll talk about that one a little bit more in a little bit. And in Alemão, they have a very well-recognized, this is a community that's internationally in the news. You almost always see it associated with crime and violence. But they have one of Rio's most innovative kind of environmental research favela units where they try all sorts of different green technologies in the community. This is from an article on Rio Watch by an architect looking at qualities of urban informality. He looks at flexibility of the design, This is an example from City of God. There's an architect from Europe that's been looking at how they actually take the public housing, which is, creates, but it can push the boundaries of our thinking and help lead us in the way. This is really important because, for example, I mentioned that in Rio, sanitation, the sewage, everybody's sewage goes into the open ocean. So there's actually much more potential if we actually take the favelas and individually create local sewage solutions, whether it's biodigesters or different types of cleaning mechanisms. We've been working with a favela called Vale Encantado, which is in the middle of the forest. And the reason we've been working with this particular favela is they have a vocation for this already. They have a co-op that's focused on sustainability. They produce food locally. They create different organic foods in their kitchen. They have a little restaurant. We've been helping them. We identified an international partner. We've been developing the biodigester here. That's what that would show the scale. Solar panels, they've started working, incorporating. And so this particular favela had development certification. It means the whole neighborhood is sustainable. And there are a whole variety of criteria for LEED for neighborhood development. So late last year, the architect, one of the co-creators of this system of LEED ND, reached out to us, and he wanted to start thinking about creating a LEED up. So the idea is a certification for upgrading informal settlements. And you look at all these different issues within a community. Residents go through and they evaluate which are their most pressing needs in terms of energy, communication, sanitation, food, common spaces, education, solid waste, access and mobility, restoration, water, and housing. And they draw those up in order of priority, right? Prioritize those that create local jobs. You look at different LEED partners, LEED technologies that could apply. And then you start a process where you actually try to upgrade the favela rather than create something from scratch. Of course, this is not a formal certification. Maybe it could be one day. Maybe it couldn't.